Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being with us. We're so honored to have you. Welcome to our very first in 2023 speaker series of Global Leadership. The Global Leadership Speakers is an initiative from the Center for Global Partnerships and Learning and the respective Associate Dean's Office here at GSCP. And our event's going to focus on the myriad of topics that impact leadership in the global space, all the way from this month to June. And before we start, I want to share some little information about our center here at GSCP. It's very special to us, and we've been growing so much that I have to do it justice. So our center provides students, faculty, and staff with various services from publication support, certificate programs, access to our respective journal, the Scholarship Without Borders, and a few other services such as cultural celebrations, information sessions, and workshops. So if you want to get involved, are interested in our programming, please do so. We have our wonderful leader, our director, Dr. Gabriela Miramontes. We have Sue Ellen Schneider de Miaria, Charlotte Green, and Dr. Asia Ghazi. Talk to any one of us, and we'd be happy to get you on board and support your scholarship needs. If you're interested in global leadership, please speak with us in the Associate Dean's Office, and we'd be happy to support you. So please allow me to introduce you to our distinguished keynote speaker, Dr. Jennie Walker. Dr. Walker specializes in developing leaders and organizations for success in complex, diverse, and increasingly global environments. For the past 20 years, she has provided professional education and coaching in leadership development, talent management, and organizational effectiveness within Fortune 500 organizations, as a professor and as an executive in higher education, also as a consulting partner in many organizations across the world. She currently leads her own consulting firm, Luminary Global, providing organizations working across cultures and with diverse constituents specific strategies, development and coaching in global, cross-cultural, and DEI leadership. She also serves as professor of practice at Indiana Institute of Technology's PhD program in global leadership. Dr. Walker is an award-winning educator, having been recognized as Faculty of the Year in 2021 and 2019, respectively, for the PhD program at Indiana Tech. Previously, she led the business leadership programs at University of Arizona Global Campus, where she was a co-founder for the Center for Women's Leadership at Forbes School of Business. She also served as a director of global learning and executive education at Thunderbird School of Management, where she contributed to global mindset research and development strategies. She regularly serves as a subject matter expert in global leadership, EI, talent development and distributed workforce management, sharing her thought leadership as a featured speaker for organizations and professional conferences such as Academy of Management, Association for Talent Development, Society for Human Resources Management, and International Leadership Association. She is widely published across journals, books, magazines, and digital media, including Journal of Management Education, Advances in Global Leadership, HR People and Strategy Journal, Inside HR Magazine, and SHRM's award-winning blog, We Know Next. She has authored several books, including Developing Your Global Mindset, a Handbook for Successful Global Leaders, Teaching Methods in Business, Experiential Exercise in the Classroom, and the Handbook of International and Cross-Cultural Leadership Research. Outside of her career, Dr. Walker is a mother to 4 young children and enjoys travel, scuba diving, creative writing, films, and of course, pets. Please join us in welcoming Dr. Jennie Walker.
Thank you so much. It is a delight to be with the Pepperdine community and with your center and with so many fellow scholars who have an interest in and a vested interest in not only researching, but living and working in this global leadership space. And that is what tonight's session is going to focus on, is many of the different concerns that enter into the global leadership space. And we're going to do this in the context of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And I would encourage each of you to feel free to use the chat or come off mute to contribute throughout the presentation. I welcome your thoughts and questions. And I'd like to begin with one. So how many of you have become familiar with the UN SDGs? You can just put yes or no in the chat. How many of you are familiar with the UN SDGs? And familiarity might mean you just know what they are. Somewhat, all right. Yeah, usually when I give talks about the UN SDGs, some people have never heard of them and other people have read books on them. And so I usually try to hit kind of down the middle here. So if I'm talking about a concept or a term that you haven't heard of, or you'd like more information, please just cue me in the chat. I'm happy to explain more. But I'd like to begin with a video, I think, that will really put much of this into perspective. And then I'll explain why this particular session is looking at criticisms. How could you possibly criticize such great goals in the world? And we'll talk about why that's important as a scholar. So let me take a moment to put up a video here. It is 7 minutes, so it's pretty short.
Our journey begins more than 14,000 kilometers from the United Nations in Papua New Guinea.
Oh, hold on just a second. There we go.
As we look at the Sustainable Development Goals, which aim to transform our world by 2030. The 17 goals were adopted at the UN General Assembly by 193 member states in 2015. The objective: produce a set of universal goals that meet urgent social, economic, and environmental challenges facing the world. What makes these goals different? Each goal is dependent on the other goals. These goals are universal, integrated, and transformative. The last goal focuses on the importance of partnership between the government, the UN, development partners, civil society, faith-based organizations, youth groups, communities, and the private sector. Despite the many challenges of life in Papua New Guinea, the government and people of PNG are making great efforts toward the SDGs. Progress will be made only if we work together. We begin with one woman working tirelessly to feed her family. Her name is Susan, and today Susan is in a field tending to her crops as her husband fishes nearby in the ocean. For Susan, her 4 daughters, and husband, their crops are at risk as the sea level rise affects the salt level in the soil. This means less access to a variety of food and a greater risk of stunting for her daughters. Susan says she's seen a rise in the sea level and also in the sea temperature here. There are fewer fish, she says. There is no reliable transport infrastructure here either, so the family often skips going to health facilities, even though malaria is rampant. Children are often delivered at home without acknowledging the risk. 2 to 3 hours. Making matters worse, diarrhea is common here, as proper sanitation practices are rare. Susan has only an 8th grade education. Secondary school is not really an option for her family, as there is no secondary school nearby. Another big concern for her: clean water. The encroaching sea is threatening their water supply with salt. For Susan and her family, she says, their big dream is simply surviving, which has become increasingly difficult. Moving to Enga province, we meet Benny Pundi, a subsistence farmer with 2 wives and 6 children. Health problems are common here because the nearest hospital is far away. Farmers here rely on rain, so their food production is very unstable. The current rain pattern has changed, and it's unpredictable, making it difficult to plant seeds at exactly the right time. They're limited to a few varieties of crops, so their children are often stunted. These same children must also walk great distances to school and rarely attend beyond early primary. That's one school, not my school. Yeah. The school of Boston. There's a school of Murite. I'm taking 1 hour, 30 minutes. All of the children help work in the fields. There are no close markets to sell their produce, So everything they grow, they eat. They have no source of outside income. Benny's family uses a basic pit latrine and has no electricity or running water. The family relies on firewood cut from the nearby forest. As for the future, Benny wants only two things.
Milaki la spurna, want la ausik. Am pasol milak tumsta.
And finally, we move to the capital of Port Moresby and the 5 Mile Settlement.
My name is Dorothy Robert. My age is 39 and I have 6 children.
Dorothy runs a small food stand she sets up outside her house each morning.
I make my barbecue, selling drinks, sausages, sometimes selling betel nuts.
They have no garden, so they need to purchase all their food. Dorothy is the only person working, so the family is always suffering from a lack of cash. Her husband has other wives and many other children. He gives her no money. This means her children often skip meals, which leads to stunting. There is also no money to buy school supplies, school uniforms, and lunch. So some of the children don't attend school. In the settlement, everyone uses pit toilets, and washing areas are in poor condition when they exist at all. And the water is cut off frequently. Violence against women is a serious issue here. A 2015 Overseas Development Institute article estimates that 2 in 3 women in Papua New Guinea have experienced gender-based violence in their lifetime. Papua New Guinea has the highest prevalence of gender-based violence in the Western Pacific region. Sadly, Dorothy too has experienced violence in her life.
Domestic violence is very commonly in the settlement.
Dorothy feels trapped by poverty. She has dreams, but worries they won't become reality unless her situation improves.
The dream for my children is I want them to be educated to earn their own living.
These are the stories of real people's lives in Papua New Guinea. The people know that they have rights and are resilient in the face of the adversity they face. Their lives are directly linked to the Sustainable Development Goals. The SDGs are about every single person's life and improving each life in a powerful way. Betterment of a nation starts with the betterment of one person's and one family's life. The SDGs are the milestone for 15 years. 15 years is an accumulation of days. When you live a life, you live a day. So each single day is important if we want a change. Time alone cannot bring us a change. We are the ones who can and must bring that change.
All right. Let me shut this down just a second. All right, and we're back. So what are your thoughts after seeing the SDGs in action here? Are there any particular issues that stood out for you? Any concern about how we might achieve these very important goals? Yes.
Yeah,
So
we have been, sorry, go ahead, Shaletta, go ahead.
No, you can go, Sue Ellen. I was just gonna say they're all connected and interconnected, right? Like you can't like literally focus on one without focusing on the other ones, right? But they didn't get there by themselves and overnight. There are all these external forces that have been part of the global economy and part of the global landscape, part of the challenges with global governance for a while that destabilize these areas. And so while the goals are lofty and important and wonderful, the question becomes, what are the places that are doing the destabilizing going to do to help the folks achieve these goals?
Yeah, so great point there about the interconnectedness. We'll talk about that. We'll talk about something called a wicked problem, which you may have read about in the literature. And Crystal, what were you going to add there?
I'm sorry, I forgot to take my yes down. My apologies. That was when you asked who had heard of the SDGs.
Okay, no worries. So let's take a look at some points around these. I appreciate your thoughts there. Why Papua New Guinea? Why was it chosen by the UN to feature all of these 17 sustainable development goals? It is one of the least developed nations in the world. And so there was a lot of opportunity, I believe, for them to really highlight some of these issues. We could have certainly taken that lens and applied it to other societies, but I think they really chose an area that is in great need of assistance and attention. So when we think about the first couple of goals that are pretty large, what criticisms would you identify with these? And these are really for your reflection here. But why would we criticize ending poverty or ending hunger or ensuring healthy lives and promoting well-being? We certainly saw a lot of very important examples throughout the video of how this is impacting people's lives in real time and really limiting their futures and the well-being of their larger families and societies. So one of the things that I'll say here is that the intent going into this presentation is really around being thoughtful about what are some of the potential challenges to achieving these. I've called them criticisms, but let's call them challenges. And how might we work to overcome those so that we can have some movement in each of these areas? So what is a wicked problem? A wicked problem, I've put the citation down there, it has been around for a long time. So since the 1970s, this idea of a wicked problem was introduced by Riddle and Weber. And they said that there are some issues in the world that are so intertwined or interconnected, as you put it so well, that there's no clear solution. We could come up with 100 solutions and they might sound great and we might make a little bit of movement, but there's not one that's really clearly going to solve the issue. When we apply one of our solutions, there may be some unforeseen outcomes. So we look at, for example, many cities across the US have focused on providing homes for people who are experiencing homelessness. And of course, one of the unforeseen outcomes that you've probably heard about is that these people often become homeless again because there are some other issues that are really driving the homelessness to begin with. That's just one example. That's a really complex issue around experiencing homelessness. The third piece that you'll see, I'm working around the graphic here, is it involves changing behaviors. And I don't know about you, but I love New Year's resolutions. I love them. They challenge me, they inspire me to be a better person, they focus me for the year. And at the end of the year, I do achieve some, but I don't achieve all of them. And sometimes there are those that dog me year after year because changing behavior is really hard and complex. And we don't always have control, full locus of control over everything contributing to our behaviors. So sometimes it's not entirely in our hands. The next piece you'll see is that these wicked problems are interdependent and multi-causal. So you saw, for example, in the video of Papua New Guinea that the last lady, she had a husband who had multiple other wives, and she was the only one working in her family. So when we look at the system, her family system and supports, her social system and support, there were a lot of different issues that were contributing to her being the sole earner in that particular family. And then, of course, they're socially complex. There are many cultural issues that one of my favorite topics to dig into is the intersection of culture and leadership. But we know that that creates social complexities. So, for example, one of the health issues in Papua New Guinea that was not pointed out had to do with the red teeth that you saw in the video. And this is from betel nut chewing, which is a very common habit around different parts of the world. Betel nuts are filled with caffeine, so much like we might grab for a coffee, people will grab for betel nuts, and it deteriorates their teeth. It's a social habit, something that people do together. They learn it from their families, and then that leads to dental decay. So that's a socially complex issue. So can a wicked problem ever be solved? And I'm sure that we're all going to go for no on that one, but I'd like to be optimistic that I do think that with the insights that we gain, the leadership, skills that we have, our passions, that we can make movement on these. Can they ever be fully solved? That remains to be seen. But let's take a look at some of the challenges that are often not mentioned when we talk about UN SDGs in our own communities or in places like Papua New Guinea. What are some of these global challenges that we should be aware of as we enter into this problem solving? So how are the goals being defined? What are the metrics and the priorities? What does sustainability really mean? What about the starting points? If we compared the US and Papua New Guinea, what would this look like in terms of the starting points on those goals? What about corruption, statelessness, gender discrimination and violence? How does this come into play? What about cultural differences with change? If we implemented the same solution here versus in Papua New Guinea, what might that look like? And then the last one that I'm just particularly passionate about is behavioral psychology as it relates to social class. How do people even view their lives and their work and how they work together? So these are the issues that I'm going to cover throughout. And one thing to note is that in my presentation screen, I can't readily see the chat or raised hands. So I will rely on our wonderful moderators here to call out when there are questions or comments, please. So let's take a look at this first issue of definitions, metrics, and priorities. So in goal number 1, for example, it says very clearly to end poverty in all of its forms everywhere. But there are a lot of very well-informed and caring people who put together this goal. So this is the short version, but there's many metrics within it that are much closer to solving specific issues. But one of the things that we want to really look at here is the language around it. So SDGs all have targets. These targets are the metrics. You can find them all. If you go onto the UN SDG website and you look at any one of the goals, you'll see all of the metrics called targets. And target 1.2 says, for example, that it seeks in each country to halve the share of the population living in poverty according to that country's national poverty line, the national poverty line. So there are some challenges when we look at national poverty line because there's a couple of different metrics that we might pull from. One is there is an international poverty line, and then each country has its own definition of poverty line. Here's what we know from the World Bank, that 50% of the world lives below $5 a day, 25% of the world below $3 a day, and yet we have some countries like the US that has a $35 a day poverty line. So these are widely different poverty lines that might make those metrics a bit difficult in terms of comparison. Now, what if we focus very specifically in on the region or the country? You'll see on the left that we have a graphic showing from 2002 to 2012. The pink is 2002, the red is 2012. The improvement, there's been great improvement in terms of the proportion of the population living below the poverty line. The 1.9 US dollars is at that time what was considered to be the international poverty line. I don't know about you, but living on less than $2 a day seems pretty challenging no matter where you are. And when we look down the graph, we see that some regions of the world are quite different than others. But I do want to point out the real positive there of the population that has improved in terms of their finances. But when we look at the very bottom, we see that there is this tremendous difference between the developing regions and the rest of the world. What about sustainability? What does this really mean? So when we dig into sustainability literature, if we were to look back at the 70s and the 80s, which for us in the US is when that conversation really took root, we see that the conversation is almost exclusively about the environment. And we know today that sustainability is so much more. A lot of the issues that were highlighted in the video, for example, have to do with social sustainability, the ability to live and work and thrive amongst one another and to have good health and well-being. And so the good news in terms of how we look at sustainability in the contemporary age is that it involves both the environment and the socio-cultural metrics alongside it. This graph that you're seeing right here, well, the table and the graphics, I should say, are coming out of University of Leeds in the UK. And they have a great institute where they have looked at what they call social and planetary boundaries. And so this is looking at how sustainability is measured. And you'll see that I've put the US right next to Papua New Guinea. My point here is not to take a very well-developed country and always compare it to a less developed country, but to show how sustainability might need to be reframed in our minds. Because when we look at the social foundation in the middle, blue is good. Blue means that those needs are pretty well met. So you can see the grid down below that says what these abbreviations are. LS, for example, is life satisfaction. So we see that those are basically well met overall in the US. Now, we could certainly argue that not all populations benefit from that, but in terms of thresholds, Leeds is saying, doing a pretty good job. Papua New Guinea, we see that there's really a lot of attention that needs to be made to the social side. But if we stay on Papua New Guinea and we look at the outer ring is the ecological, the planetary boundaries, if you will. So that traditional environmental view of sustainability, we see that they are in the clear. White is good. It means that they do not have a strong footprint that is really impacting the environment in a negative way. There's a little bit of red down in the land use change, but if we were to look at Papua New Guinea on face value around the environment, they're golden. They're doing a great job. But at what cost to their society? So there's very little being done around the social sustainability, and there's some intricacies linking these two things together. The lack of development is not necessarily helping with the social condition either. But if we look over at the US, we see a lot of red, not doing such a good job with our footprint in the planetary boundaries, but much better job on the social side. So which society is more sustainable? And this all depends upon how we look at and define sustainability. So we could have an entire semester just examining these issues alone. And so I know that this is a light treatment, but it's just to plant the question of how are we really examining sustainability as scholars in terms of our own analysis and criticisms. So let's take a look at this idea of unequal starting points. So when we look at Papua New Guinea and the USA, for example, we see that their societies, their modern day societies in terms of their current social structure and government started at very different times to begin with. So we have about a 200-year difference there from the time that they became independent nations. We see that the populations are quite different in size. And one of the things I want to point out about Papua New Guinea that's quite interesting and not unique in the world, look at the languages. There are 839 indigenous languages, and that's not a very big country. 839. So to implement any of those goals, any solutions would have some additional cultural considerations that we would need to take into account. Certainly with the limited schooling that's available there, you know, that might be something to consider, is how many of those different ethnic groups are really being attended to from a schooling perspective, and how much of that has to do with culture and language. There's often quite a link between those two things. When we look at infant mortality, as you might imagine, there's quite a distinction with Papua New Guinea not having a lot of access to medical care and facilities. Those numbers are not where they should be. Access to clean water and sanitation look pretty different as well. We saw that in the video. Not a lot of doctors in Papua New Guinea for the density of the population. Literacy is not all that incomparable, so pretty close there. Literacy, as many of you know, is defined very differently from country to country as well. We're not always talking about apples to apples, if you will. And then the GDP of these nations is quite different. So what does this all mean? The resources that are available to address these issues are drastically different. The populations that are being served are drastically different. And the people who are available to really lead the solutions, the attention to each of these issues is going to be quite limited in a smaller nation compared to a developed nation. So when we look at something like having poverty in each of these countries, that might be difficult. And so this is where the idea of partnerships becomes really important. And I know that many doctoral students and scholars and faculty really have a heart for international development and partnerships. There are great ways to reach out on the UN website. The UN SDG website has a whole area for collaborations. You can go on and you can join yourself to help with any number of nonprofits that are working on these issues. So here's an example of the US. I've spent some time talking about Papua New Guinea, but let's take a look at unequal starting points in terms of the US. I love these colorful maps that give us a sense of where improvement is or is not happening and at different rates. So green, if you look in the top right corner, a green state would mean that the SDG has been achieved. And you can see that the US, what is currently considered the second most developed country in the world, has not achieved any of the SDGs that are supposed to be completed by 2030. Lots of challenges, and there's a lot of major challenges that remain. Look at all those red states, major challenges. Now, some things to keep in mind that are pretty interesting here and probably worth a whole dissertation. Look over on the left at where the slowest progress is in the US. Ending poverty has had the lowest progress in the US. And you'll see the states ranked over on the right. You can see that Vermont is doing a little better than some of the other states. And then we have the southeastern portion of the US that's not showing up in those top ranked states. Good health and well-being is suffering in the US. And here's the point to really drive home here. No goals are improving fast enough for SDG attainment by 2030. It's very important to think about how we formulate and look at goals. Could it be that when the SDGs were formulated and all of these really important metrics, targets were established for each of the 17 goals, could it be that there should have been perhaps a different approach in how those were metrically defined? I think there might be a hand up. I can't quite see.
Yeah, Shaletta has her hand up.
Right.
I was gonna ask, and you kind of touched on that. Like, it's really interesting when a bunch of academics get in a room to plan out things, because most often we're looking at a high level,
Yeah.
And we never stop to ask some of the practical things. I mean, because intellectually we know these things, but most of us are not living on the ground. And
Mhm.
so often the solutions don't really meet not only the needs, but the social cultural things that you brought up. Because if you ask someone what they need, what we think they need is very different. And so
Mhm.
I'm wondering, as you know, as you're asking these questions going forward, how might we as scholars adjust how we're thinking about that, and who else needs to be in that room that lives on the ground that can give a different perspective?
Yeah, that's a great point and a great challenge there. And I would say that I think that there's a lot of power in bringing these targets down, really narrowing the scope to the community level, the community, because when we look at the world, of course, we're going to get some terrible inequality just because of these unequal starting points. But when we can really focus in further, you know, we know, for example, when we look up at New York, that there's a lot of different areas of New York. So it's a yellow state, which means that overall it's doing pretty well. But we could go into some areas of New York and find that that's not really the case. And so I think that there's great power and a great message for community leaders to be looking at these targets and really zooming in on their communities to see where they can make impact. And so I think that this is where we have hard choices as leaders. Do I attack all 17 of these? How do I prioritize them? Might be the better question. Are there other
Yeah.
thoughts on this? All right. So another issue that I said that we would chat about here is corruption. For those of you that have not seen this before, I highly encourage you to visit Transparency International. Now, like any research out there will always be gaps and issues with the data. That is just a given for any research that we do. There's no such thing as perfection, but it is one of the best data sources around looking at corruption in different parts of the world. So you can go to the site and get a much cleaner sense of what are the specific metrics that they're looking at. How are they deciding what corruption even means? And there's a great cultural conversation to have around that. But it is one of the most widely used global rankings in the world for corruption. You'll see that it looks very specifically at the public sector. So it's what's known and how the public sector is perceived by experts and business people living and working around these areas. The score is a combination of at least 3 different data sources, and you'll see that there are 13 corruption surveys and assessments involved. So they really have done a good job to try to make this robust. But you'll see that most of the world is red, and like most graphs, red is bad. So let's take a look at this a bit further. Just to go back to our 2 points of comparison here that we've been looking at. The United States actually doesn't come off so great in terms of scores here. We are in the orange, and Papua New Guinea is in the red. So what are some of the data sources used? What does this mean? Corruption is defined in terms of bribery. We know that culturally bribery is more commonly accepted in some countries than others, or cultures, I should say, societies. Diversion of public funds. Officials using public office for private gain, ability of governments to even contain the corruption in the public sector, excessive red tape. I have a student doing their dissertation on red tape. It's an interesting area. Nepotistic appointments in the civil service, and laws ensuring that public officials must disclose their finances and potential conflicts of interest. Legal protection for people who report bribery and corruption, and then state capture by narrow vested interests and access to information on public affairs and government activities. So a lot of different measures there that are used to look at corruption. But when we think about the SDGs, let's say that we're going in to do something pretty simple, like we'll use poverty SDG 1 here because it's a very, it's the slowest improving score in the US. So it certainly applies. And in Papua New Guinea, if we go into, do something that seems really beneficial, such as establishing an aid program for, people to have funds, let's say, for their families, to have food for their families. Excuse me. What might be the corruption issues that we would encounter in the various societies that we're working in? How could we ensure that that money is getting to the right people, that the food is getting to the right people, that the vendors that are chosen will not be corrupt? Oh, excuse me. So corruption is something that we have to really think about in terms of the SDGs. Another point that I'll bring up, and I'm just going to have some water here. I invite any questions or thoughts while I'm doing that. Another issue that I mentioned is statelessness. And statelessness is a growing problem. We know from the UN Refugee Commission that there are a growing number of stateless people in the world. I have some pictures here to illustrate some of the different reasons and issues around statelessness. In a global leadership program, we often talk about this idea of a global citizen. Well, one of the fundamental starting points to be a global citizen is to be a citizen of some place. And we have so many people who are struggling with this. Certainly in the US, we have conversation around this in terms of our neighbors and where borders have crossed people and societies and what that's meant in terms of their access to services and education. Let's look at a few of these in other parts of the world. So in the top left, we see a man named Julius, and he was an orphan who left Russia as part of a marginalized ethnic group, was forced to flee, and is living in another European country. Well, many people who flee don't have papers, and that's the case with him. And so he is not able to have access to work. So he has to do odd jobs under the table and has no future promise of being able to change that life because he does not have any avenue to resolve that. When we go over to the far right, we see a woman in Myanmar, and she and her daughter were born there. They are actually, from that region, but because she is from a marginalized ethnic group, she is not allowed access as a citizen to any of the privileges there. So one person was not born in a country and can't get access. Another person is born in the country and can't get access. Why does that happen? Well, as you all are digging into your scholarship, it's important to look at how citizenship is defined in different nations. Some countries recognize by birth, others recognize by blood, so you have to show ties, and others have different systems of awarding citizenship. Sometimes it can be earned and sometimes it can't be. In the case of Myanmar, there's a lot of inter-ethnic discrimination. When we go to the bottom left, we see a family. This family is from Venezuela, who's had just really terrible political and economic issues over the recent years. I visited there about 15 years ago and just had a really wonderful experience, met a lot of great people, and it's a very different place today, very difficult place. And so this is a family that fled Venezuela, fled political persecution, fled because there were no jobs, and they're living in Colombia, and the children don't have access to education. Now, if they had continued on up the land bridge of Central America and they'd gone to Costa Rica, it'd be a very different situation. no matter where you're born, if you're a child under the age of 18 in Costa Rica, you have access to all services and education. The adults would not, but the children would. So where people flee to makes a difference. And then, of course, we have an image of a war-torn area, refugees who have left Syria in the bottom right. So a lot of different reasons why people become stateless, but the UN SDGs very rarely apply to these populations because they may not qualify for services. And this is something really important to keep in mind, as this is a growing population. So taking a look at
Walker,
yes, go ahead.
excuse me, Dr. Gabby has her hand up.
And I guess this ties to two things. The first one you mentioned was about the citizenship and how different countries approach citizenship differently. It was interesting because I've always taken my citizenship here in the United States for granted, just by the sheer reason that I was born here, regardless of where my parents came from, right? I was born here, I'm a US citizen. And when we went to Dubai last year, finding out that in Dubai, it doesn't matter whether you're born in the country, it doesn't matter whether your parents have been there, for many, many years, like none of that really matters. It's very specific as to who can have citizenship. And granted, while they're actually making a change, they're creating a visa for retirees, if you will, it's still based on contribution into their economy, right? And so it was a fascinating dynamic because it was so foreign. That concept of citizenship was so foreign to me. But even hearing you speak to that and what you're saying about some of these areas and the resources. So that's my first point. My second point is, it's interesting that you talk about education and where people migrate to and from where people migrate to and the reasons behind it. One of the conversations we've had multiple times in the leadership courses is around, the whole immigrant conversation and what immigrants bring to the table here in the United States. My parents are immigrants from Mexico. And so the patterns have always intrigued me, because one of the things that I've, through my own dissertation, because it was based on business in Mexico, but also just anecdotal experiences, wealthy Mexicans do not immigrate to the United States, right? It's only those that are seeking opportunity, not those that have wealth. And in fact, those that have wealth have significant wealth. They're just like here in the US, they're traveling to Europe for vacation and shopping. They come to the US as leisure, and they go to the areas of wealth and Rodeo Drive and New York City and things like that. It's a very foreign concept when all you do is, not you personally, I mean you, the greater you, look at immigration especially from Mexico as depleting of resources, and everybody wants to come here and we have to be so vigilant and all those negative connotations. And what I'm hearing as you're sharing this in other areas of the world, those migration patterns are very similar. They're seeking out opportunities, and depending on where they go, they might have less opportunity or more opportunity, but it's always in relation to where they're coming from.
Yes, excellent points. And Dubai is a fascinating case around, especially when we look at the labor forces and citizenship in Dubai. Venezuela is another really interesting case right now. The US had, for a time, announced that there would be refugee status visas for people leaving Venezuela, and many people who did not have the funds or the papers to fly or otherwise get transportation into the US walked it. And they walked all the way from South America up Central America, and halfway there, the visa got shut down. And so what we have is an international humanitarian crisis in Central America right now, where literally whole communities of Venezuelans are just on the street corners begging for whatever they can get because they have no place to go. They can't go back and they can't go forward. And so, this situation of citizenship and who has access and who doesn't has far-reaching consequences, as we know. And one of the things that I would, put a cap on this discussion with, just food for thought, is as you're going out in the world to do these great things that you're going to do with your doctorate and with your scholarship, what is the place of people who are stateless? Because there are very many of them. And sometimes we put these artificial restrictions on our programs and our outreach efforts that may not reach the people who are in the greatest need. How do we bring them into the picture? So a couple of other things about statelessness. So what is it really? Definitions are important to really understand the issues here. So we see that it's somebody who's not considered a national by any state under the operation of its law. That's pretty terrifying to think that there's more than 10 million people in the world that no state believes they belong to. What are some of the reasons for statelessness? Discrimination. I gave you a few examples there. Emergence of new states. Julius, in that first example, was pushed out because of the emergence of a new state. Transfers of territory between existing states. Borders move. They move across people. Conflict of nationality laws, and then also refugee status. So you'll see that the status of statelessness is often passed down to children as well, and it creates an uncertain future. There's a lot more to learn here, a lot more to really dig into, and so I've put the source on the slide there as well. A quote. Millions of people still suffer the lifelong denial of their human rights because of statelessness. Okay, so here are a group of women that you see on the slide with a very interesting slogan behind them. No sex for fish. No sex for fish. This is in Kenya. I've put a map there to show you where they are. This is around Lake Victoria. It's an enormous lake. Has anyone been to Kenya or to Lake Victoria? We have someone who's been there. Charlotta, did you experience, this situation or hear about this situation while you were there?
We heard about it briefly. I wasn't quite in that area. I have a friend that's from there, so we spent most of the time on the farm with her and her family.
Nice. Yeah, it's a beautiful area. Of course, there's a lot of complex social issues that are going on in this example I'm about to share, but it is the intersection of some sociocultural issues as well as corruption. And corruption on a very local level. So what we have here is a situation where Justine in the top corner, she is the head of this movement called No Sex for Fish, and she's gotten some great support internationally and some funding to help her. What you see is that men principally own the fishing boats around Lake Victoria, and this is a central source of income and food for many people in the area. The women, of course, do not own the boats, but they need the fish in order to create food products that they can then sell for their own income or purchase for their families. Well, money is not enough in that region. Many of the men have worked out relationships where they refuse to even sell the fish unless the women give them a quid pro quo of sexual relations. And it's so common that there are names for this kind of arrangement. So you'll see here, it's a small community. The population's about 1,000. We talked about the gender divisions, and the fish population is dwindling. So we've got an environmental issue going on. And this is causing even more tension around who gets fish. And so it's so common that in the local language, this practice is called jaboya. And for many women, their survival depends upon the fish. And there's a horrifying statement here from this woman saying that she doesn't care if she gets HIV. It's more important that she gets fish in order to sustain her living. So this is at the intersection of many of these issues, corruption, and certainly gender discrimination and violence. And, so we can talk about some of the SDGs in this area. For example, the environmental issue of the fish population. But as we're in there addressing that, as we're looking at solutions, we'd have to be acutely aware of what the dynamic is around these fish to really do this in a gender appropriate way that is not going to further marginalize these women, of course, and put them in greater harm's way, but also to hopefully resolve this issue that is intertwined with their food and economic source. Oh, I went one too far. So one of the other issues that really we don't see a lot of treatment of in the SDGs as they're written, but is certainly something we have to pay attention to at the local level, are the issues of culture. And so this is a map I'm sure many of you have seen. This is Hofstede's dimensions. We could even be talking about globe dimensions, although they're slightly different. They've built on Hofstede. And so we see the different cultural distinctions around the world as it relates to these 6 cultural dimensions. And so without going into this in great depth, the idea here is to be thinking about, if we are focused on a particular SDG, how might our solutions that we're proposing and even our partnerships be modified to the local cultural norms and practices? Some of the cultural differences in leadership that we know are relevant are I'll pop them up here. Reframing consumption. So how is consumption even looked at a cultural level? Certainly that fishing source, they may look at overuse of fishing a bit differently when their whole livelihood and well-being depends upon extracting those fish, for example. Re-examining power and systems. This is culturally embedded. We call this power distance. And so how is the system of power and the view of power and the systems around it really impacting the goal that we are working on and the collaborations? And then what do new business models and metrics look like around this as well? So many of the cultural dimensions were originally formulated in the 1960s and 70s. Globe has built upon them further in the 1990s and beyond, creating 2 different types of collectivism, for example, that are really, really important for how we explore these issues. One of them is our degree of collectivism in our society. Do I know my neighbors? Do I interact with them? And the degree of collectivism in the workplace. Do I think it's normal to work in teams or more individually? And those could look very different in the same society. The US is a great example of that. And then social justice, how is that conceptualized by the society that we're working in? That's going to look quite different as well. So when we're looking at sustainability, it's helpful to zero in on the region of the world that we're applying this to, and then also the individual societies. And what we see on the right, if you haven't seen this before, this is the globe clusters, where different cultures have been clustered by some of their similarities. Certainly doesn't mean that they're all the same, but there's some central tendencies that tend to be similar. It's a really interesting way to look at cultures. Israel, for example, if you take a look at the graph, it lands in a rather interesting area. Has anyone identified where Israel is? Latin Europe. Latin Europe. Why on earth is Israel in Latin Europe? Well, because many of the people who immigrated to Israel came from Europe, and some of the cultural tendencies tend to map around more European trends. It's one of many interesting aspects of the globe research. So the last piece that I really want to touch on here is around the social psychology of social class, or the behavioral psychology of social class. Social class is a really fascinating area because, speaking as a US-based researcher, I was born here and raised here, even though I've lived in many other parts of the world. Social class is something that in the US, we often hesitate to talk about. In fact, I've done many presentations around social class where I've had people vehemently disagree that social class is even an issue within the US. There are some places where social class has been minimized, and it is in any other part of the world that I do presentations, people tend to be very much on board that social class is an issue. So regardless of where you sit personally on how important this is, how relevant it is in terms of how we view the world and how we interact with it and what this means for the SDGs, let's look at a few data points around this. So what we know from research is that divisions between social class as it's defined, so socioeconomic class, the resources that one has available to them, and resource is a broad word there, but it certainly includes finances, it includes access to hard goods, a home, education. They're becoming wider, not narrower, across the world. So this is a growing conversation in the literature and among scholars. We know that material conditions have a lasting impact on people's identity. They influence how we think and feel about our social environment and social behavior. So for example, part of my family came from a very underprivileged group and had never had anything firsthand, struggled to put food on the table for many years. They were subsistence farmers, had a legacy of that, and people were very protective of what they had. So really influenced how they viewed goods and privileges. What we know from research about people who come from these stressed environments of resources is that they're much less likely to define themselves in terms of their socioeconomic status. They're much more likely to have an interdependent self-concept. So we might call that collectivism. More likely to have a lower sense of personal control. So what does that mean? Well, when we talk about the SDGs and coming into communities to do beneficial work and in partnership with the community, how much control do the people that we're working with or serving really feel that they have around their own community or their own well-being or the livelihood of their families? We know from research that it's quite low in low social class environments. They tend to score higher on empathy and are more likely to help others. We also know that, here's an example here. Working class people are less likely to apply for positions in universities where middle class norms prevail. We know this from the higher education literature. They're also less likely to be selected because of their lack of experience in those areas, and less likely to stay if selected because it doesn't really match their cultural norms and expectations. So this idea of social class becomes really important. In fact, when I was in Costa Rica in February with a group of students, we met with a community organization, and the leader had worked for very large NGOs around the world for most of her career. And she said, I have based my practices on all the things I learned not to do in these huge NGOs. And we hear stories of this. For example, in the Peace Corps, that, well-intentioned groups go in and they establish, all kinds of additional appliances and processes and procedures, and they get abandoned over time because they haven't really worked with people around their own cultural norms and practices and expectations. And so what she's done in her organization is she's made sure that the ideas come from within that community, that the people who are really involved in setting the goals, in taking the actions, are the people within that community. And she's also providing them with education and support that helps them feel more empowered around what they can achieve and what is possible, and helping them have the resources to then have that confidence. Because we know that this is a major issue to build leadership within communities that have been stressed for so long, generations, legacy of under-resourced situations. that they may not believe that they can help themselves. They may not have trust in the system. So social class becomes really important in this conversation around the SDGs. Here are a few things that you might find interesting as I wrap up here. A few things around social class. The highlight here saying that people from lower classes fundamentally have different ways of thinking about the world than people in upper classes. And it's something that we need to really consider when we talk about public policy, not in terms of limiting any population or privileging another population, but really in thinking about what kinds of conversations do we need to have. We see, for example, and I'll just look at the first one here, perceptions of social rank. You'll see that the middle class, when in studies of the middle class, that people often think that they have a choice around how they live their lives and what they do. They believe that there's opportunity available to them, that they believe that it is their right and ability to express themselves. But when we look at the lower social strata, they're very sensitive to the threat that might arise if they make choices, if they express themselves, if they pursue opportunities that might seem out of line, and not just from people outside of that community, people within their community. So my ex-husband is from a really rural area in Peru, and his mother won't leave their little farm to go to the city without much coercion, because if she brings anything back from the city that might be perceived as a luxury, she'll be the target of things being ruined or stolen. They had a cousin who bought a new motorcycle and it was immediately demolished by people in the community. Now, I'm not suggesting that everybody in a community would behave in this way, but the way that people respond to situations does have some influence based upon their socioeconomic experience. So that's what I would highlight here. So why bother with the SDGs? That's a lot of negative information, right? I think that it's really important as we pause here to think about why bother. Well, what brought us to the work that we're doing? For me, we're all going to have different answers, right? For me, it was really about wanting to make the world of work better for all of us. I saw so much corruption. I saw so much inhumanity in small and large ways, so much discrimination and unfairness. And I knew that we could do better. And so for me, I really approached global leadership studies as a way to learn more about what can we do to improve our daily working lives and relationships. And for you, that could look very different as well. What do you value? I think that when we think about the SDGs, we're not going to achieve all 17 of these ourselves in our lifetime. So which of these really resonate with you? Which of these areas do you really want to contribute to that you can add your voice and values? Or maybe add the perspective that people aren't seeing around a certain population, like I've mentioned, around a certain social strata. What are some of the issues? One of my favorite things as a scholar is to serve as a subject matter expert on projects, because if I can add just a different voice or perspective, I think that there's so much value. What do you care about? What are you going to do with that doctorate and that research, that book that you're writing? Going forward, what do you really want your legacy to be? So why these goals matter, there's a few reasons that I would highlight here. They inspire collaboration. We know that wicked problems cannot be solved on our own. They may not be solved in our lifetime or at all, but we can make a difference. We saw that poverty had diminished quite a bit when we looked across a 10-year time span. We can create platforms for connection. I think there's real possibility there with all of the work that we and others are doing. There's agreement out there that all of these goals are important. I think that it's positive to have a sense of agreement about these being important. Shared goals help us provide a focus for the work that we're doing. It helps with motivation and the sense of unity. I think that the projections make goal achievement possible in some cases. If you were to dig into the metrics a bit further, you will see that in some parts of the world and across societies, there has been some movement. So are these goals entirely too ambitious? In some areas, yes. In other areas, maybe not. But I think that there's lessons here that we're going to take away from these. And when 2030 comes, we're going to sit down and look at these and say, you know what? Some of this was really worthwhile. And some of this, we're going to have to redefine how we approach it. Success fuels success. So even if there are 20 metrics in one area and we've made progress on one or two, that can inspire more progress in other areas. And then lastly, I think that there's real hope here around this idea of sustainability leadership that is beyond environmentalism. Environmentalism is incredibly important. So if we don't have a planet, we have no place to live. Very important. But the social sustainability part, I'm so glad that that's part of the conversation, because ultimately it's a vision for a better world. So the question here as scholars is, what's your why? And then lastly, what I'll leave you with is a quote. And this is one that I really personally enjoy. What's your why? Well, for me, this resonates. Do not be daunted by the enormity of the world's grief. Do justly now, love mercy now, walk humbly now. You're not obligated to complete the work, but neither are you free to abandon it. So what can we do to touch on each of these goals and collaborate with one another? And with that, I'd like to open it up for thoughts, questions, dispute. I always love dispute. I've got the sun coming in here. There we go.
I don't know that I have any disputes. I find all of this fascinating. I think a lot of times, especially in the leadership space, we have these conversations that are pretty siloed, and don't kind of take into account all of these nuances, right, from a global perspective. So hearing you share all of this was just really fascinating for me. It's something that it's piqued my curiosity, and now I feel like I want to dig deeper.
Oh, good. That's always great.
I
there
really
any-
enjoy your, yeah. So I really enjoyed your presentation and this idea of when we discuss this kind of issue, sometimes we tend to just discuss the negative side of it. And yeah, there is the solution is not easy, but if nobody takes a part on it and do at least one little things, we want to improve. So maybe we won't be able to solve completely some of those problems, but if we don't abandon it, as you mentioned, and we do a little bit of it, we can move forward as leaders. And this is something that I really think leaders, global leaders, they should take more actions, even though small actions. And one thing that I think we should promote more, and we have discussed it also with Dr. Schachman, is, this missing piece of international collaboration, and not only between countries, but private organizations, other spheres, not only nonprofit. Let's involve the for-profit business, because they needed their business to be sustainable. So why not involve more the giant food companies in the world to help to solve the problem of the hunger in Africa, for example? I truly believe that leaders should take more responsibility on that piece.
Yeah, it's a great point. When we were in Costa Rica, we visited a very, very large company. It's, like a Fortune, probably like a global Fortune 10. I hesitate to say the name because my example here is going to be a little bit negative, but they had a lot of resources and they went to the local communities. It was not their location of headquarters, but they had this office in Costa Rica, and they had all these pictures on the wall of them handing out gift bags to people. And it was beautiful and it looked wonderful, but then you looked in the gift bags and they weren't really things that were pertinent to the community's needs. And so I think that one of, the piece I would add is around, yes, I mean, we absolutely need these big corporations. Philanthropy is very important, for redistribution of wealth and resources, but we also need the inclusion from the community. And that's the piece. So many of these issues I brought up tonight are around inclusion of people who don't have a voice and they don't have a seat at the table, or they look at the world in very different ways based upon their lived experience. And so how do we bring those collaborations together in genuine ways?
Hi, everybody. I was only involved in the past, 10 minutes. I rushed home. I had an event at church to see this because I have been intrigued by the 17 sustainable goals since I did my comps. I did my comps around that. And I don't know if you talked about this, how you related it to urban America, if any, in any way, but I had interest in and I'm from Detroit. In Detroit, middle schoolers, even elementary schoolers, and how they're developing a global mindset with the thought of, how are their schools supporting anything like that? Do they have access? Do they know? And, after 2030, when new goals are set and elementary school students, will be ready. I think the global mindset is more open than it was ever before, just by social media and what kids can see, but really having an identity of saying, I can do something to impact the world, particularly for African-American young men in urban cities. I just find interest in that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this was a much broader global kind of perspective, but one of the points that I brought up is around how do we bring this down to our community level? Because this is where these goals that seem so broad, the metrics that seem so broad, we have to bring it down to conversations in our own communities. And that's where we have to be able to prioritize, because we're not going to hit all 17 of these. There's more than 100 metrics and targets if we look at this. But how do we prioritize for our own communities and partner in ways that are culturally relevant and sustainable?
Yeah, I think that it's that whole contextualization, right? What's the context? And then how do I meet that context in a way that helps it make sense in the spaces that you're in? Like the state I'm in is in the red on your map, which doesn't surprise me in any way, shape, or fashion. The US South, in many ways, treks and trends with what we would see when we really begin looking at the low-lying areas or the rural areas with other underdeveloped nations. Just because of the economics and the ecology of the space and what's going on. And the class differential that we don't want to talk about. So as you're thinking about this and as you've given us this challenge as leaders, again, I don't know that our leaders in the United States often pay as close attention to these SDGs because they're embroiled in other foolishness. And what that looks like for us to engage with them around, we could make a difference in this space in our country, one, but also impact other countries, two, and make a difference if we did this. Like, how do we begin that conversation with the leaders? Because they've got to be involved, not just the community, right? Like, you've got to have that governmental aspect of things. Oftentimes the community will be involved in something that the government is not going to throw any money at.
Yeah, in terms of resources, on that page that I mentioned on the UN SDGs, excuse me, for collaborations, they're almost exclusively nonprofits. So where's the
Right.
government involved? Yeah,
Right.
good question.
Well, I mean, but this is a big piece of like what the government says it's invested in, right? Like governments around the world got together with from the UN perspective and said, these are the things, right? Even though they had these other folks, governments have said this is important, and it's like how then do we as scholars? Because this is a scholarly question and not necessarily a community cultural question. How do we begin to engage at that level with the leaders in order to kind of make this is urgent, and not in the political polarization space, but this is an important concern for your constituents and their well-being.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that we see in the UN SDGs is that there isn't like a formalized structure about who's doing what. And we know from basic business practices, basic organizational practices, we would have our RACI model of who's responsible, accountable, when's this going to be done by, and there's not much of that. It's optional for many nations, but there's this peer pressure, if you will, of the reporting coming out of it. But some people will care about that more than others, and some people will be more aware than others about what's going on. So all kinds of great governance questions that you're alluding to, for sure. I think that, for each of us in our work, one of the greatest things that we can do is to share our scholarship and perspectives, publish, present on your perspectives, your findings around each of these in your communities or global populations you're working with. Well, I know we're hitting time here, so I do want to see if there's any final thoughts or questions here. All right. Well, thank you for your thoughts and your time tonight. I really appreciate it.
Dr. Walker, I would like to thank you so much in the name of the center for being here with us, for providing us with all this wisdom about the sustainable goals. That's it. With that, I think we can close the session. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful evening, everyone. And I hope to see you in our next session in May 4th.
Good
See
night.
you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Good night.